So one thing about me is I love bag charms, keychains, I love bumper stickers, I love water bottle stickers, I love pins, badges, anything that shows a little bit about my personality, my beliefs, what I stand for. I love t-shirts with slogans on them. But what I love even more than that is creating my own versions of this craftivism and sharing it with other people and sparking conversations, finding my people, if you will. I really loved Sarah Corbett's 2017 TED Talk about craftivism. Sarah Corbett is another amazing writer and activist and another crafter. And while Betsy Greer coined the term craftivism, Sarah Corbett, I would say, really popularized the term online. She wrote this amazing little book called A Little Book of Craftivism, which I would highly recommend. And when Sarah Corbett talks about craftivism, she basically means craftivism equals slow activism. She basically says that it gave her an opportunity to reflect like she hadn't before. Craft is naturally slow, therefore it forces you to make time to stop and reflect on what the issues mean, whom the injustices affect, and how we can be a part of the solution. Craft connects your heart, your head, and your hands, and when you relate that to justice issues, it can be world-changing personally and politically. Although there are amazing people like Sarah Corbett and Betsy Greer who have successfully popularized the term craftivism online, the intersection of craft and political activism has a rich history spanning over a century. For example, when we think about the women's suffrage movement, Lisa Kathleen from the National Museum of American History said that merch, such as pins, banners, and postcards, have been around for a very long time. They help us to find others who think like us, to identify yourself with a cause, to show that it's something that you believe in, and help spread the word, which I love. Another fascinating form of craftivism took place in Chile during the totalitarian regime that was forced upon the population during the 70s and 80s. Arpilleras, or otherwise known as burlap, were bright-colored patchwork pictures stitched onto burlap sacks. They were mainly created by the women who lost the men in their lives who were either disappeared or detained due to the evil regime of Augusto Pinochet Ugarte. He overthrew their then government and established a dictatorship. Around 40,000 people were victims of political imprisonment, torture, and violence. The women stitched tapestry, which told the stories of their hunger, their fear, unemployment, housing shortages, and then their missing family members. It was a means to document the oppression where all means to free expression were lost. Working together and sewing the arpilleras was a way to share the atrocities placed onto them. Once a month, the new arpilleras were collected and then taken to a church who distributed them internationally. The earliest ones were smuggled out of the country in diplomatic pouches. Another fascinating form of craftivism that I recently learned about is the Migrant Quilt Project. The Migrant Quilt Project is a series of artists, activists, and quilt makers who created a series of quilts using materials they collected from areas that migrants used on their way across the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona. The Migrant Quilt Project is meant to draw attention to the many lives of migrants who are hoping to cross the U.S. in order to attain a better life for themselves and their families. Vanessa Fiardo from the Arizona Historical Society states that the Migrant Quilt Project is ongoing until they reach their goal of going 1 year without a quilt. In other words, a year without a migrant death in the Sonoran Desert of Arizona. The project was started in 2005 after hiker Jordy Ibsen walked remote migrant trails discovering layup sites with clothes, water bottles, and other items that were left behind by migrants. The quilts made from clothes and materials gathered in the desert represent each death or disappearance of victims who are forced to cross borders in remote and dangerous areas. I found both of these movements so fascinating and inspiring, how it took so many people to come together for a cause and fight for something that they truly believe in. And in this case of the Migrant Quilt Project, it is still ongoing. So back to thinking about modern day craftivism such as buttons, totes, quilts, bumper stickers, etc. What I'm making here in this video, I think it's important to consider the actual impact of these forms of contemporary political craftivism. Betsy Greer and Sarah Corbett themselves talk about the power of collective action, getting people in the community together as a gathering for resistance, protest, and activism. Sarah Corbett herself often talks about how taking part in craftivist activities can be helpful for the shy person who may be intimidated by loud protests or may not feel safe taking part in demonstrations. For one example, I also think it's important to mention that for a US person, typically a white individual, getting arrested at a protest in general isn't going to face any serious life-changing consequences. However, a BIPOC individual or an immigrant innocently participating in a protest can trigger potentially catastrophic situations for them. This is very obviously demonstrated during ICE protests, where ICE agents have literally been kidnapping people. However, some people question the effectiveness of craftivist efforts. For example, Shannon Black wrote a more nuanced take on the Pussy Hat Project that took place during the rise of the Me Too movement during Trump's first presidency. Black brings up a valid point about how the Pink Pussy Hat Project was predominantly created by white, middle-class American women who had the leisure and resources to buy the yarn, which is expensive, and participate in the movement. Black also pointed out that the premise of the pussy hats were bound to a specific anatomy and excludes transgender women. I can understand this perspective, and I do hope that most of the activists marching in the Me Too movement also have a respect and a passion to fight and stand for victims of sexual assault who may not specifically have a vulva or identify as a cisgender woman. What I'm making here is the Palestinian watermelon. The watermelon has become a ubiquitous symbol of resistance for people who stand with the people of Palestine. People use the watermelon emoji as a way to avoid the potential of getting shadow banned on social media, an effort by Meta basically to censor anything to do with Palestine online. Through my research, I discovered Watermelon Maps, which is basically this incredible site. I highly recommend it. You can sort and see businesses all over Canada that stand in solidarity with Palestine, either by following BDS principles, otherwise known as boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel. Watermelon Maps is also meant for Palestinian-owned businesses or companies that overall just want to share that they support and stand against the occupation, apartheid, and genocide being forced upon Palestinians. I also want to say that while I am making this video, this topic of craftivism has opened my eyes to so many different forms of craftivism that I couldn't even begin to include basically a fraction of them in this video. There were causes that I found interesting, but in no way, shape, or form concludes all of the incredible artists around the world making efforts for social justice through craft. And I definitely want to continue my research into more forms of craftivism down the road, and I definitely want to take part in some in-person collective action around my city, creating craft. Sarah Corbett also talks a lot about doing craftivism alone, quietly, sitting with yourself, allowing yourself the time, because this is slow activism. You're sitting with the injustice and giving yourself time to think about how you feel about the issue and how you want to work to solve it or stand with people who are facing this injustice. And I personally think that taking the time for yourself to engage with something creative in itself is political, especially in this capitalistic society. I basically think that the only value we're told we have is how productive we can be and how much money we can make so that we can go out and spend it to fill the pockets of these corporations. The power is within us to engage with these artistic practices without the fear of it not being good enough or not making any sort of significant change. Also, in a world where most of us are burnt out, tired, stressed, stretched financially, and who feel time famished, myself included, I really find Sarah Corbett's ideas about the power of sitting with yourself powerful. I personally think that doing this while watching a show or listening to a podcast is okay, but the crafting while giving yourself the time to sit with the issue, engage with your own thoughts and opinions on the matter can be tremendously powerful, and you never know what might come out of it. Okay, see you in the next one.